Hi, and welcome to part two of basically selling your business and the transition process. I'm Eric Gilboard, and this is Elisabeth Colson. We're into the phase during the transition, and so Elizabeth and I are going to talk about various things that a seller should be anticipating in terms of the work that will be involved in the actual process of due diligence and, a buyer really wanting to get in, under all the nooks and crannies of your business and find out everything that they can before they actually sign a final agreement to purchase the company.
And Eric, when you talk about that, I mean, the things that come to my mind from a business perspective are the dreaded and onerous due diligence process. And the buyers need to really be very careful about the representations and warranties the sellers need to be very careful about the representations and warranties that are being made in any sort of purchase documentation, because oftentimes liability for the seller will continue past the closing with respect to whatever those representations and warranties are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at a speaking engagement last night in front of a room full of financial advisors, and someone came up to me afterwards and says, well, if the owner has perhaps possibly misrepresented the numbers, how can anybody find out that they've done that? And I said, well, anyone who's, ready and willing to write a check for a reasonable sized company will clearly have people with them that can look through the numbers and figure out, what's true and what isn't. And this person looked at me and said, well, the numbers don't lie. And it's like, that's an incredibly naive statement. And I guess the lesson here is that even if you think that you can fool people with the, messing around a little bit with the numbers, anyone who's trained will be able to go in and see exactly what's going on. So the idea of full and honest 100% disclosure of your business, and whether it's the numbers or operations or, sales or marketing, what have you, you've got to go into this with 100% honesty.
Absolutely, because you will be caught out, and the process, as I said, is quite onerous. Typically, a purchaser is going to want to see at least 3 years of prior financial statements, and there's going to be plenty of representations and warranties for that. They're going to want to see books and records, shareholders, officers, directors. They're going to want to see all the material agreements. They're going to want to know if there's been any material changes in the business, and the seller has to be forthcoming with all of this, because they have to look at it from the perspective of everything they knew and were intimately involved in now is going to be transferred to someone else. And just the way they needed and wanted full disclosure when they made every decision, that's what the buyer was looking for as well, and needs in order to write that final check. So it's a process that it's far better to get all the skeletons out of the closet and deal with them up front than be surprised and have the dreaded thing that happens 5 minutes before closing that can cause an abatement in the price or a delay in closing or financing to be pulled by a third-party finance.
And I'd like to point out that it's not necessarily that a seller is purposely hiding something or trying to be deceitful. You run a business for 20 or 30 or 40 years possibly, and you've done things in a certain fashion that suit the nature of the company. And you may have done something 10 years or 20 years earlier, and you've completely forgotten about it because that's just the normal course of business for your company. But then someone starts looking through, your materials and looking through all the aspects of your business, and these things pop up. So, you're going to want to spend some time up front pretty much assessing and analyzing your own business so that you can uncover things first and correct them, or at the very least, bring them to the attention of the purchaser.
No, that's very true. And as I said, the representations and warranties are a significant portion of any purchase agreement and can often run 20 plus pages. And what I generally do, and I don't think it's universally loved as a process with my clients, but I really think it's a necessary one, is I drive them in here and we sit down and we take the 1 or 2 or 3 hours or whatever it takes to go through each one of them very painstakingly to make sure that everything that the seller could honestly think of is being thought of and brought to the forefront so that we can deal with it all and present it proper.
Elizabeth, maybe there's some cases that you can think of where something was innocently misrepresented, or maybe give us a list of some specifics that when we talk about the warrants and whatnot.
Sure. So there's innocent misrepresentation. I mean, I've seen that, I guess, in different ways and means. Somebody can have forgotten that they have a lot of documents that just they don't have purchase orders. They may or may not even have a master service agreement, and so they just say, yeah, well, whatever company has just always done business with me, and they may just by virtue of memory not recall how many there are per year or what the average number is or amount per purchase order. Any buyer is going to want to know what's going on with the employees. Do they have contracts or not? Do they want to hire these people or not? Are these people likely to be supportive of the transition and to work with a new buyer and owner or not? So employment agreements are very important and are often a point of negotiation, because the seller doesn't want to be responsible for ongoing liability if the buyer hires someone and doesn't like that person, and the buyer doesn't want necessarily, in all cases, to inherit the years of historical service, because that would impact their obligations if ever they wanted to terminate the employee. So that becomes an issue. Leases, any sort of third-party contracts are important. Do they allow for a transition of the business without the consent of the bank or the landlord or the supplier or the equipment owner or whatever it is? So we have to go through all of those and make sure and get those consents lined up, because that takes time. Other things that would be of significance, well, financial, any sort of litigation, obviously, any unpaid taxes or even tax reassessments, those can all sort of come up and bite you unexpected.
So the bottom line is that no matter how long you think it's going to take to go through this process, i.e. the preparation and the actual due diligence on behalf of the purchaser, it is definitely going to take you longer. It's going to be harder. It's going to be far more time consuming than you think. And as an owner operator of a business, unless you have a really strong management team in place that can move forward without your time required, it's likely going to be very difficult to run your business and go through the selling process at the same time. I mean, a lot of sellers innocently, if they've never done this before, innocently, naively think that, well, my accountant will take care of providing some numbers and I'm sure the purchaser will want to meet the staff, and that's kind of the end of it, but that's not necessarily the real world.
No, and that's why, I mean, we've alluded to this in previous talks, Eric, that people often will bring on somebody to help them with the transition. They need to bring on an interim manager or something to help run the business while the seller is busy collecting the documents, or they'll take a very trusted senior employee or person from their own management team and have them devote much of their time to this. Because a lot of it, too, has to be done not subversively or covertly, but carefully, because you don't want to unsettle the employees or the client relationships as you're going through that transitional process, because it may not come to fruition. You want to control when the message gets heard.
And oftentimes it doesn't, come to fruition. So, we look at it this way, that their senior management clearly needs to be in the loop of what's happening. There's also the folks that are below the senior management, and selectively, some may need or not need to be involved as well. If people are roaming around the office, and if folks are not informed of the real story, so they're not clear on exactly what is going on, when someone doesn't have the real story, they are, by human nature, requiring themselves to fill in that story. So all of a sudden, you're going to have, what are essentially unrealistic ideas of what's going on at the time. So, while you want to let people know that there's a transition going on, or you're talking to some folks, you're going to have to tell your staff kind of how they fit into it. But, I would underline all that with, this may or may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, we are in the process, and likely there will be someone else, unless it's a one-off kind of an arrangement where perhaps it's a strategic partner who decides to come in and make you a totally out of the blue, unexpected offer to purchase your company. But if you're in that mindset, in that process of, yes, I do want to transition out of the company, then if it's not this purchaser, it's going to be the next one or the one after that. What you're trying to avoid is disruption. You're trying to avoid people creating their own idea of what's going on. And you're trying to keep things as normal as possible in the day-to-day running of the business.
And that's very true. One of my clients went quite far down the road with one prospective purchaser and then couldn't come to terms for various reasons, couldn't consummate that particular deal. And so took a step back from everything, waited about 3 to 4 months, and then found some alternate purchasers. And had the business owner tipped their hand too much, it could have caused an awful lot of distrust and feelings of malaise within the company. And that's only going to harm the business and bring down the productivity and impact the numbers, and in turn, obviously, adversely impact the ultimate sale price.
One of the experiences that we've had in the past is, and it actually happened before we got into the transition side of things, and we were helping companies with sales and marketing and other services. And we would say to the owner of the company, if you're thinking about growing the business or possibly, transitioning the company, you can count on one thing, that the last person you expect to approach you will be the first one. And by that, I mean, you have a loyal employee who's been with you for a long time. They could be kind of middle level or possibly even senior. But once they recognize that there's going to be change in the company of some sort, oftentimes a person doesn't want to see change. They like the company the way it is. So if you're on an acquisition tear and you want to buy a bunch of companies, don't be surprised if somebody comes along and says, well, I'm not so sure I want to be a part of the future of this organization, because they just liked it the way it was. And so, while they may be concerned about a company growing too much, they will be probably more so concerned about, possibly new management coming in.
Yeah, that's very true. And that's why the controlling the message is really important. And I know that you and your team can help strategize with that, and I do as well. Sort of, when is it relayed? How is it relayed? Do you have a team meeting, staff meeting with your own staff without the purchaser there? How far down the road do you go with the purchase before you share this information? And that can be influenced by several factors. Among them, again, as a key piece, is the landlord and the employees. You don't want your landlord to think that you're going to be switching over and you go and get a consent and then it doesn't happen, and it just sort of destabilizes things. So the timing too is a little bit of a tightrope, and oftentimes it's worth kind of talking it through with whatever advisors the business owner has in play.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there's no guideline necessarily. There's no real way of having a step-by-step approach to it. There's, some idea of what you have to do, but every situation is different. The relationships between the owners are different. We haven't even talked about family being involved in the business, and perhaps children of the owner, some staying on, some not staying on, some staying on in a perhaps a lesser role because the owner has elected to sell to an outside party. And then you get into that whole family dynamic, and maybe there's, 2 or 3 siblings that are involved in the business on a day-to-day basis, but none of them are particularly suited to manage or run a company. So, the whole thought of bringing someone in from the outside who is now the boss, and it's no longer going to a parent to, state your case. You're now working for someone else. That's a whole other dynamic that needs to be discussed. And that's probably tougher than, dealing with the employees, in terms of a company. Dealing with your own family is going to be very, very difficult.
And those are usually better conversations to have a little bit earlier on, and sometimes in very managed circumstances as well. Sometimes mediators are good there, to have third parties there to sort of get the issues out, and then the family members can go in and talk about them within a sort of better framework where at least everybody's been heard. Because as you say, if there are competing interests or feelings of lack of appreciation within the family, why are you bringing in somebody new when I've been doing this to my own eyes so very well for so very long? All those sorts of things will necessarily impact the feel of the business.
Okay. And we've talked about a lot of the legal aspects of kind of a due diligence, but then there's the other side of due diligence, which involves operations and finance and sales and marketing and HR. We talked briefly about, talking to the staff, and clearly a purchaser is going to want to talk to all the staff to get a sense of who it is that they're quote unquote purchasing. Because at the end of the day, that is what they're doing. They're taking on these individuals, and they're going to want to know what their ambitions are and what their feelings are. And sometimes, interestingly enough, staff can clue a purchaser in on perhaps some of the negative side of the business, but also, some of the opportunity and some of the positive side of what's going on. And, your purchaser, a really experienced purchaser, is going to want to do that. They're going to want to look at your operations in detail. They're going to want to look at your sales in detail. They're going to want to talk to your customers. There's nothing that you cannot reveal to a purchaser when they're about to write a big check to take over your company. They're going to, any responsible purchaser is going to want to look at all the marketing materials you've created over the last couple of years, all the marketing programs, all the sales activity, customers that are come and gone, customers that are loyal, but perhaps the customer's only loyal to the company because you have a personal relationship with them that goes back 3 decades. These are all the things that are eventually going to come out.
And that's why, as the purchaser is sort of taking a look at everything in this way, that often there will be provisions that's in a letter of intent that say that the seller is constrained from doing anything outside the normal course, whether it's financing or taking on a new customer or divesting themselves of operational space. I did a transaction about a year ago where the seller had decided that it just wasn't worthwhile to maintain the existing space, and so had to disclose why were they reducing the space. They had to disclose the shift in their business that had given rise to that need, and it was something that the purchaser certainly looked at to understand whether or not the business would be sustainable anyway.
Yeah, and another point is opportunities. Now, oftentimes you'll talk to a seller and he'll say, well, Eric, there's a lot of different things that this company could do. There's some really wonderful opportunities. And, their question is, do I reveal those opportunities or don't I? Well, as a starting point, you're going to sign a mutual NDA with whoever it is that's looking into the business. So to a certain extent, you're protected, and you might want to comment on this in a moment. As well, don't expect that if you're going to reveal these opportunities, that all of a sudden a purchaser is going to jack up the price because they see all these wonderful opportunities. They're not realized opportunities, they're just potential. At the same time, you don't want to hide them because it just makes the whole idea of the purchase that much more desirable. So there's kind of a fine line. I think if it's perhaps a competitor that is looking to purchase your organization, and, in spite of the fact that you've signed mutual NDAs, I think you might want to be a little bit cautious about that. I don't know if there's any ways to 100% protect yourself, but, opportunities are a little bit of a yin and yang kind of a thing. There's a negative and there's a positive to how much you're going to say.
And unfortunately, an NDA is an absolute first step, but it is an imperfect one. I think fundamentally what you need is good faith between the parties who feel that they really are going to try to enter into this agreement. They really are going to do their best to adhere to their respective obligations. But an NDA is only as good as the electronic paper on which it's not printed. And to go ahead and enforce it, you have contractual rights, etc. And it can be as sort of complete as you want in terms of indemnification and injunctive relief. But still, if I tell you something about my business and you go out and use it or tell it to the world, I'm the one that's playing catch up and having to enforce rights. And it's time consuming and it's challenging, and there's no guarantee that I'm going to prevail. So in addition to the NDA, which, as I say, is crucial, I think both parties really have to have faith in each other to a significant degree before they start the process.
It's interesting. It comes down to people, emotion, judgment. I mean, on the point of revealing opportunities, once it's out there, you can't take it back. So before you do that, I mean, I guess what we're saying is to be very, very cautious. And if it looks like someone is the right kind of purchaser, cautiously optimistic is a pretty good way to move forward. But I believe that it's not a world of you can't trust people. I just think that you have to be careful as to what you do, and maybe you feed information on a as you go basis. There's no finite rules in terms of how things work, and there's no way of knowing how someone is going to respond to this new relationship. It's kind of like dating, at first everything seems wonderful, and wow, this is the perfect person. But then once you get to know them, your opinion might go up in some areas, it might go down in other areas, but you absolutely have to be very, very careful. And unfortunately, as you said, there's no 100% way of protecting yourself legally.
No. This was on my list.
What else is on my list? Well, let's talk a little bit more about HR and about people and how we're dealing with them. You talked about employee agreements. We've talked in the past about partner agreements, that type of thing. So, if someone is doing the due diligence, and it will come out very, very quickly, obviously, that if you have a partner or two and you don't have a real agreement with those partners, it can throw the whole thing into a mess.
Particularly if the partners aren't aligned in terms of what they want to do. And sometimes, and it sounds very strange, I mean, I've seen businesses where, yeah, we're like 50-50, but there's no evidence of that. Some businesses even can, just have sort of divided the money up without any formal share organization. And somebody put money in and thinks they're an equal partner, but they never really participated in the business. And so other people have a different view of what they should be getting out in the event of a sale. So yes, to back up a few steps and make sure that you have a proper partnership agreement or shareholder agreement is an important piece. But it's also, once you're down to the end of the side of the spectrum of exiting and wrapping up, it's not 100% crucial, because if the partners are aligned, they can do what they want to do, even if there is a shareholder agreement that would have had other provisions, as long as people consent to what goes on, notwithstanding the shareholder agreement, that consensual agreement can prevail.
But what if they're not aligned? And so you have partners, and one partner wants to sell because they're perhaps 10 years older than the other partner, but the younger partner is going along with it to see what happens. But, in the back of their mind, they're going to find a way to, slow down the potential for a sale. They may not even want a sale. They may have ulterior motives, and a partner may say, well, I'd like to buy the company for X from my partner, and the partner doesn't want to sell it for that price. And so they enter into talks with other potential purchasers. But then all of a sudden, the one partner sabotages things as you're going through the due diligence process, where maybe they potentially hold back information, or they volunteer perhaps too much information. A lot of things, again, can happen, during that process, where if somebody truly wanted to sabotage a potential sale, there's many, many ways that they could do that.
Yeah, and that's sort of the relationship management piece. And I think you're raising a good point. It's not only vis-a-vis the outside world, it's also with respect to what's going on in-house, similar to with the family members. The partnership is a work family, and though those same types of concerns can definitely arise.
We were in a situation with the company, and we were doing some due diligence on the side of the seller. And we spoke to, one of the employees, and this employee was not a high level. I mean, they were actually kind of a lower level employee, but they had an awful lot of opinions, and their opinions were not necessarily in line with where the owner was going, where the owner had been taking the company for, basically the last 10 or 20 years, and where the owner thought the company could go. And, unless you do your own internal due diligence, and i.e. you start talking to your own employees beforehand, there was a risk there, because we uncovered it, because we were doing interviews with employees on behalf of the seller. But what we uncovered was that if a purchaser were to sit down with this employee, he would hear a whole other story about the company. I mean, different target group and different mission and different vision. And at the very least, a purchaser would be sitting there thinking to himself, wow, they've got employees that are totally out of line with what they think their company is doing. So, it may be innocent. It may be something that you've allowed to happen over the last number of years because yeah, it's a low-level employee. It doesn't make that much difference to the running of the company. But now all of a sudden, there's 2 or 3 or 5 different opinions of, who the company is and who the company should be targeting and where the company can go. And you need to control that narrative. You need to control that story so that everyone is basically singing from the same song sheet.
And that also speaks to how the business is run, what level of transparency has been provided, what level of openness with the employees, and is it warranted? It may not be appropriate in some cases, and in some instances, like how do you treat them, and do they get Christmas bonuses, and do they get rewards just for doing a good job? And that too makes a very different environment that a purchaser is going to look at and hear from when they come and do their due diligence.
The other thing is the size of your own company, the number of employees that you have. There's a big, difference between having 5 or 10 or 15 employees, which, would seem somewhat manageable, to having 100 or 200 or 250 employees, and you have, difficulty controlling, what they all might think. Now, you could take a great percentage of those employees, perhaps 80% of a large number, and, chances are a purchaser isn't going to, talk to those folks. But, you still have that risk. Someone's walking around the factory floor and they start talking to someone, unless people understand what is happening. And this is where you're going to have to disclose to a certain extent to pretty much to everyone, this is what's going on. And we're going to be bringing somebody, around, and they may, ask you a question. Or you're working on the lathe over here and they may ask you how long you've been doing it. And, I don't know how many hours you work a week. It could be any kind of an innocent question. And all of a sudden, someone else who's, potentially not been briefed is actually representing your company. And that's a very dangerous position to be in.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And at the same time, those types of visits, you want to manage them as well from the interpersonal perspective, but also from business interruption. You don't want to have somebody come around and then have a bunch of people on their coffee breaks talking about it and being disaffected and being concerned. So,
we should talk a little bit about the next section, which is the third part of this trilogy that we're doing, and that's the post-transition state. And, there's a lot of emotion that's involved in post-transition. There's a lot of financial issues, i.e., how do you take this lump of money that you've now come into and move it from, being over here with the business and the value of the company and moving it so that you don't end up writing a really huge check to the government of Canada when you don't necessarily have to. We're going to talk about the emotional side. I mean, oftentimes, when you're talking to a seller at the early part of the process, it's not unusual for a seller to say, well, Eric, I don't know what I'm going to do. If I sell the company, what would I do? And I believe part of what you do in terms of your relationships with sellers, and what we do certainly, is talk about those things in advance. And so we're going to spend half an hour of our trilogy talking about that post-transition. If you have any questions, we would invite questions to come in advance. That would be terrific. We want to make sure that we address the requirements of the audience and so that everyone's getting as much as they can out of this. And we're looking at other topics for future webinars as we go along. So if you have any suggestion of the selling process or the transition process that you'd like to have us explore, our plan is to bring in other guests to provide perspective and information and ideas that go beyond Elisabeth's scope of work and my personal scope of work. So we want to open this up to be an ongoing series to help you through this entire process.